Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. I'm here and this is part 3 of our mini-series on colonialism. If you haven't seen the first 2 videos, I highly recommend that you check them out. One talks about how Europeans went from seeing Africa as worthless to realizing it was full of riches and people they could exploit. And the second one talks about the Berlin Conference and how Europeans split up Africa like it was some sort of cake. You can find the links in the description below. Anyways, in today's video, we re-talking about how the British East India Company became the most powerful entity in India. So let's get into it. Before we get into the video, I just want to quickly say that the term East India Company is a little misleading. At its peak, the company actually controlled more land in Asia than it did in India. But anyways, we're going to call it the East India Company for simplicity's sake. The British East India Company was formed in 1600 by Queen Elizabeth I of England. The original purpose of the company was to trade with the Chinese and the other Asian countries, and not to colonize or rule over anyone. However, that all changed when the Portuguese showed up in India, because the Portuguese were doing something that the English really wanted to do. They were controlling key ports, and through that, they were able to control the trade in the region. This was very bad for the English because they had come to rely on the sea trade to make money. In fact, there was one spice in particular, black pepper, which came from the Malabar coast in India. It was worth way more than gold. So the English needed to have access to India. However, the Portuguese weren't going to give them access so easily. In 1580, the Portuguese king, Sebastian, actually offered Queen Elizabeth the opportunity to buy all of his possessions in the East, including those in India. Elizabeth turned down the offer, though, because she didn't want to pay what he was asking for, and because she didn't trust the Portuguese. This was probably a good thing for the English because in the end, if she had bought them, the English might have become like the Spanish and Portuguese and turned inward and forgotten about the rest of the world. So in order to get around the Portuguese and into India, the English did something quite ingenious. They decided to sail directly to India instead of going around the coast of Africa. And in 1608, they set up their first trading post in Surat, which is still standing today. From there, they started to build up their power and influence in India. However, there was another European country that also wanted to trade with India: the Dutch. The Dutch were a major player in the colonial game, and they especially wanted to take control of Indonesia. Or rather, the Dutch East India Company wanted to take control of it. They had previously tried, but they failed because the Portuguese kept beating them. So the Dutch needed a way to get stronger. In 1621, the Dutch asked the English to join them in a war against the Portuguese. But once again, the English refused, because the English and the Dutch had never been friends. And they had fought against each other in Europe, plus the English didn't like the Dutch West India Company very much because the Dutch were doing the same thing to them by setting up trading posts in the Americas and taking away their trade monopoly. Instead, the English allied themselves with the Marathas to fight the Portuguese. The Marathas were a Hindu confederation located in the Deccan Plateau in central India. And they were great allies for the English because they hated the Portuguese even more than the English did. But after the Anglo-Maratha War of 1775 to 1782, the Marathas lost a lot of territory. But they still held on to a large amount of land. But let's go back to the Dutch. The Dutch had been trying to invade Portuguese holdings in India since 1639. But they couldn't succeed, so they made a deal with the French. The French actually had a pretty big colonial empire at this point, and they also wanted to beat the English. So they teamed up with the Dutch, and together they invaded the Portuguese. This worked for a while, but then the English, the Portuguese, and the Dutch all realized that it would be better if they were allies instead of enemies. So they signed the Treaty of 1661, and under the terms of the treaty, the English got Bombay, while the Dutch got everything else. But the English knew that they could get more if they played their cards right. So in 1707, they went to war against the Marathas again, and this time they won. Now, they took control of Bombay in 1661, but it was only a small trading post. But now they had defeated the Marathas, and they were in a position to take the rest of India. At this point, the English realized that they could make a lot more money if they shifted their focus from China to India. In China, they had only been able to get a foothold in Canton, while in India, they now controlled most of the coastline. So in 1708, the English built Fort William in Calcutta, and this marked the beginning of their colonial empire in India. Soon after, the French would try to attack Calcutta, but they would fail. And in 1757, the Battle of Plassey would take place. This battle was between the British East India Company and the Nawab of Bengal, who was the ruler of the Bengal Sultanate. The English won this battle, and it is often referred to as the First Battle of Indian Independence. Why? Because the British basically won this battle without fighting. Yeah, that doesn't make any sense. How does winning a battle without fighting mean that it's the first battle of independence? Well, you see, the English had bribed one of the Nawab's generals, Mir Jafar, to defect during the battle. As a result, half of the Nawab's army didn't fight, and the English only had to fight against half of the Nawab's army. But why would a general betray his own country? Well, there are many reasons. One of them being that the general had been insulted by the Nawab, and another one being that the general was in massive debt. The British capitalized on these internal divisions in India and exploited them in order to conquer India. They didn't just defeat the armies of India, they also defeated the political leaders. After Plassey, the English began to expand rapidly. In 1764, they conquered the nearby province of Orissa, and in 1765, they conquered the province of Varanasi. By 1772, they controlled all of northern India except for a few areas. To secure their gains, the English set up a system of local rulers, who would essentially act as puppet rulers. These local rulers would keep their titles and their positions, but they wouldn't have any real power. Instead, that power would reside with the British. As a result of all these victories, the English were becoming extremely wealthy. But the riches of India were also attracting the attention of another European power, France. France had recently gotten done fighting the 7 Years' War, and they were looking for new places to conquer. When they heard about the riches in India, they thought, hey, let's go check that out. They sent a general named Louis Bourgneuf de Montmeg to lead their forces. However, his attempt to capture Calcutta failed, and the French would lose the resulting battle. So now both the French and the Dutch had lost their chance to conquer India, and it was all because the English had beaten them in battle. But it wasn't because the English were better fighters or had better weapons. It was because the English used history to their advantage. Throughout the series, I've talked about how Europeans had studied history extensively, and they used those lessons to their advantage. They learned about the mistakes of others, and they avoided them, while also trying to avoid the successes of others. For example, when the English came to Africa, they saw how the Portuguese had mistreated the Africans, and they knew that if they wanted to be successful in Africa, they needed to do things differently. And they did. They didn't use the slave trade as much as the Portuguese had, and they focused more on controlling the entire process of trade instead of just selling slaves. Similarly, when the English came to India, they learned from the mistakes of the Portuguese, the Dutch, and the French. They knew that these Europeans had tried to conquer India before and failed, and they knew why they failed. One of the main reasons why these Europeans had failed was that they had underestimated the Indians. They had thought that they could just walk into India and take it like they did with the Americas, but that wasn't the case. The Indians were too numerous, and they were too well organized. These Europeans had also tried to rule over India, but failed because they simply didn't know the area well enough. They didn't know the language, and they didn't understand the religion. So the English implemented a different strategy. They didn't try to rule over India directly, rather they left the ruling to the Indians, and they just took control of the economy. This worked out well for them because the Indians continued to do most of the governing, and they didn't have to worry about learning an entirely new culture. Of course, this still led to some problems, but overall, it was much easier for the English to govern this way. Another reason why the Europeans failed was because they had fought amongst themselves. The English, the Portuguese, the Dutch and the French were constantly fighting each other in Europe, and they brought that rivalry to India. This meant that they were distracted, and that they were unable to focus on taking down the Indians. The English capitalized on this by making alliances with the Indians against the other Europeans. Lastly, the Europeans had grossly underestimated the potential of India. They'd only been using it as a source of raw materials and spices. But they hadn't realized that India itself was actually the valuable thing. The English, however, would realize this eventually, and they would begin to develop their colonial infrastructure in India. They would build roads, railroads, canals, and factories all over India, and this would transform India into an industrial powerhouse. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, please hit that like button and consider subscribing. As always, thank you so much for watching.